The smell of a nursing home is something you never truly get used to. It's a distinct, suffocating blend of stale lavender air freshener, boiled vegetables, and the sharp, undeniable sting of industrial bleach. They use the bleach to scrub away the scent of decay, but all it does is mask the quiet desperation of people waiting for the clock to run out. I am 65 years old. My name is Rosy. For 30 years, I was the head trauma nurse at a Level 1 emergency room on the south side of Chicago. I have held the hands of gang members as they took their last breaths. I have seen bones shattered like porcelain, flesh torn open, and the darkest, most depraved things human beings can do to one another. I survived the relentless chaos of the ER because I learned early on how to turn my heart into a vault and my nerves into steel. And yet here I was, tucked away in the suffocating quiet of the Golden Pines Assisted Living Facility. My mild arthritis and a dwindling bank account had convinced me that this was the safest option. A quiet retirement, a surrender, until the phone rang. The voice on the other end was a young administrative assistant from St. Jude's Medical Center. Her tone was rehearsed, clipped, and professionally detached. "Mrs. Rosy, I'm calling regarding your daughter, Clara. She's been admitted to the emergency department. She took a rather nasty fall down the stairs. She's stable, but we need a family member notified." A fall down the stairs. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and venomous. In my 30 years in the ER, I had heard every lie in the book. Women who walked into doorknobs, women who were just so clumsy around the kitchen, women who tripped over the dog. I knew the geometry of a genuine fall. I knew the specific bruising patterns of a tumble. And I knew with a cold, terrifying certainty the distinct, defensive fractures that come from raising your arms to protect your face from the fists of someone who claims to love you. A chill washed over me, starting from the base of my spine and radiating outward, freezing the blood in my veins. The arthritis in my knuckles suddenly didn't matter. The fatigue of my age vanished, replaced by an ancient, primal surge of adrenaline. "I will be there," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a voice I hadn't used in years, the voice of a triage commander. I hung up the phone. I knew the rules of this facility. The overnight nurses wouldn't let me leave without a doctor's discharge, and my son-in-law, Dustin, was listed as my emergency contact. He would be notified if I tried to sign myself out. I needed a diversion. I waited until 2 a.m., the hour when the night shift is at its most lethargic. I pressed the call button and lay back on my bed. When the young nurse, barely out of her 20s, rushed in, I was clutching my chest, my breathing shallow and rapid. "My chest," I gasped, mimicking the exact symptoms of a mild ischemic event I had witnessed 1,000 times. Radiating pain, left arm, shortness of breath. Panic flashed in her eyes. She didn't check my vitals thoroughly. She just grabbed the phone and called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, I let them load me onto the stretcher. But the moment the ambulance doors closed and we were 3 blocks away from Golden Pines, I sat up, my breathing suddenly completely normal. The young paramedic stared at me, his jaw dropping. "Son," I said, my voice steady and authoritative. "My heart is fine, but my daughter is in an ER across town with a broken body, and if I don't get to her, someone is going to die tonight. Let me out at the next intersection." He hesitated, but he looked into my eyes and saw something that made him swallow hard. He knocked on the partition. The ambulance slowed to a halt. I slipped a $50 bill, my emergency stash, onto the gurney, stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain, and ordered an Uber from my phone. The drive to the suburbs felt like crossing into another universe. We left the gritty, honest concrete of the city behind, transitioning into winding tree-lined streets with perfectly manicured lawns and towering oak trees. The houses here didn't just shelter people. They projected wealth, status, and an obsessive need for control. The Uber pulled up to Dustin and Clara's house. It was a sprawling, modern colonial estate. From the outside, it was the picture of the American dream. Flawless landscaping, tasteful landscape lighting illuminating the stone facade, and a massive mahogany double front door. I stepped out of the car. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, damp chill in the air. I didn't go to the hospital. Clara was safe in a hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and nurses. The real danger wasn't in the ER. The real danger was here, in this house, where my 10-year-old granddaughter, Leia, was sleeping under the same roof as the monsters who had put her mother in the hospital. I used the spare key Clara had secretly given me years ago. The lock clicked, and I pushed the heavy door open. The air inside was sterile, smelling of expensive vanilla diffusers and lemon polish. It was a house completely devoid of warmth. I stepped into the foyer, my wet shoes sinking slightly into an immaculate custom-made white carpet. It was the kind of carpet that demanded you take off your shoes, a carpet meant to be admired, not lived on. I didn't take off my shoes. "Who's there?" a voice called out sharply from the living room. I walked forward. Sitting on a velvet designer sofa, holding a crystal glass of white wine, was Brenda, Dustin's mother. She was a woman who spent a fortune trying to freeze time. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her face tight from expensive procedures, and she wore a silk dressing gown that probably cost more than my first car. She looked like a queen sitting on a stolen throne. She lowered her glass, her eyes narrowing as she took in my damp coat and my muddy shoes staining her precious white carpet. "Rosy," she said, her voice dripping with a mixture of shock and sheer unfiltered disdain. "What on earth are you doing here? And look at your shoes. You are ruining the imported wool." I didn't look at the carpet. I looked dead into her pale, calculating eyes. "Where is Leia?" "Leia is asleep," Brenda snapped, standing up, trying to use her height to intimidate me. "Dustin is out. Clara had a clumsy accident. There is absolutely no reason for you to be here, breaking into my son's house in the middle of the night like some common vagrant. I suggest you call a cab and go back to your facility." She emphasized the word facility like it was a disease. In her eyes, I was nothing. I was a black woman from the South Side, a retired nurse living on a fixed income, an inconvenience to their pristine suburban narrative. She thought my silence was submission. She thought my age was weakness. "I'm not leaving, Brenda," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the expansive room like a scalpel. "I am staying right here until my daughter comes home." Brenda let out a short, mocking laugh. "You have no authority here. This is my son's house. I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Before I could answer, the heavy front door slammed open, shattering the quiet tension of the house. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, echoed through the foyer. Dustin. He stumbled into the living room, bringing with him the suffocating stench of cheap whiskey, expensive cologne, and stale cigar smoke. Dustin was 40 years old, a former college athlete who had let his wealth soften his body, leaving him broad, heavy, and dangerous. His designer suit was crumpled, his tie undone. He stopped, swaying slightly, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on me. "What the hell is she doing here?" he slurred, pointing a thick, aggressive finger in my direction. "She broke in," Brenda said smoothly, swirling her wine. "I was just about to call the police." Dustin sneered, a cruel, ugly twist of his mouth that made my stomach churn. "Get out," he barked, taking a heavy step toward me. "You're not welcome in my house, you old hag. Get your muddy shoes off my floor." "Your wife," I said, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my tone unnervingly calm, "is in the trauma ward with a fractured orbital bone, 3 broken ribs, and a severe concussion. Would you care to explain how those injuries match a fall down a carpeted staircase?" Dustin's face flushed a deep, violent red. The alcohol stripped away whatever thin veneer of suburban respectability he usually wore. His narcissism couldn't handle being questioned, especially not in his own domain, and certainly not by me. "I said get out!" he roared. From the top of the sweeping staircase, a small, terrified voice broke the silence. "Grandma?" I looked up. Little Leia was standing on the landing, clutching a worn-out rag doll. Her eyes were wide with terror, her small body trembling in her oversized pajamas. She had heard the yelling. She knew what the yelling usually led to. "Go back to your room, Leia," Dustin snapped, turning his rage toward the child. "Now!" Leia flinched, shrinking back into the shadows. A switch flipped inside me. It was the same cold, absolute clarity I felt when a code blue was called in the ER. The emotion vanishes, the fear evaporates, and all that remains is mechanics, anatomy, and pure, calculated action. "Do not speak to her like that," I said, my voice dropping an octave. Dustin turned back to me, his eyes burning with a violent, unrestrained fury. "You don't tell me what to do in my house," he snarled. He lunged forward. He was big, he was angry, and he was fast for his size. He raised his right hand, a massive, heavy palm aiming to strike me across the face, aiming to break me just like he had broken my daughter. Brenda gasped, stepping back, anticipating my fall. But I did not fall. I did not flinch. I did not step back. In 30 years of emergency medicine, I had restrained meth addicts, subdued violent psychiatric patients, and held down men twice Dustin's size. I didn't need strength. I needed physics. As his arm swung toward me, I stepped inside his arc. I didn't block. I intercepted. I caught his thick wrist with my left hand, stepping my right foot firmly behind his lead leg. With my right hand, I didn't form a fist. I extended my index and middle fingers, pressing them with brutal, surgical precision directly into the radial nerve bundle just below his elbow joint. The human body is an intricate machine, but it has fatal design flaws. The radial nerve is completely exposed right at that junction. Apply 30 pounds of targeted pressure there, and the brain registers a pain so agonizing, so absolute, that the entire nervous system shuts down to protect itself. Dustin's momentum carried him forward, but his arm went instantly dead. A choked, wet gasp escaped his lips as the pain ripped through him. I twisted his wrist sharply, locking his elbow, and used his own weight to drive him straight down. He hit the floor hard, his knees slamming into the plush white carpet, driving the breath from his lungs. I maintained the lock, twisting his arm up behind his back just an inch past its natural limit, forcing him to keep his face pressed into the floor. The entire altercation took less than 3 seconds. Silence descended on the room, heavy and absolute. The only sound was Dustin's ragged, agonizing wheezing as he struggled to breathe against the carpet, his face turning purple. I looked up. Brenda was frozen in horror, her wine glass slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering on the floor. The red wine splashed across the white carpet, looking exactly like blood. I didn't let go of Dustin. I leaned down, bringing my face close to his ear. I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "Let me make something exceptionally clear to you, Dustin," I whispered, my voice as cold and hard as the tile in a morgue. "You are used to dealing with people you can intimidate, people who freeze when you raise your voice. I am not one of those people. I have sewn faces back together. I have restarted hearts. And I know exactly how to break every single bone in your arm without leaving a single bruise for the police to photograph." He whimpered, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of a bully who had finally met a predator. "If you ever lay a hand on my daughter again," I continued, applying just a fraction of an inch more pressure to his joint, eliciting a muffled shriek. "If you ever raise your voice to my granddaughter again, I will not call the police. I will simply dismantle you. Do we understand each other?" He nodded frantically, his face grinding into the carpet. I released him, stepping back and smoothing down the front of my coat. Dustin scrambled away, clutching his numb arm, coughing and dry heaving, his eyes wide with a newfound primal terror. I turned my attention to Brenda. She was backed against the wall, her arrogant facade completely shattered, staring at me as if I were a demon that had just crawled out of the floorboards. "Brenda," I said, my tone shifting back to conversational, polite, and completely terrifying. "It is late. I am tired. I will be taking the guest room at the end of the hall." She swallowed hard, unable to speak, and just nodded. "Excellent," I said. I looked down at the shattered glass and the red wine soaking into the pristine wool. "And Brenda? You missed a spot. I expect this carpet to be flawlessly clean by the time I wake up." I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked toward the staircase. Leia was still standing on the landing, her eyes wide, but the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet awe. I walked up the stairs, my joints aching, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in my chest. I reached out and gently took Leia's small, cold hand in mine. "Come on, baby girl," I said softly, giving her a warm, reassuring smile. "Grandma is here now. Nobody is going to yell in this house anymore." I led her down the hall to her bedroom. I tucked her in, pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin. I sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed and her eyes fluttered shut. For the first time in months, she looked peaceful. The next morning, the house was silent. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning. It was the tense, suffocating silence of a hostage situation. I woke up at 6 a.m. 30 years of hospital shifts had permanently wired my internal clock. I dressed, moving carefully to favor my stiff knees, and walked downstairs. The living room was empty. The red wine stain was gone, the carpet scrubbed raw. I walked into the massive, ultra-modern kitchen. It was a kitchen built for show, not for cooking. Gleaming black marble, professional-grade stainless steel appliances that looked like they had never been used. I opened the massive double-door refrigerator. It was stocked with sparkling water, expensive prepackaged salads, and champagne. No real food, no warmth. I rolled up my sleeves. If I was going to turn this house into a prison for them, I had to be the warden. And the warden controls the environment. I began to clean. I didn't just wipe the counters. I sterilized them. I moved with a deliberate, rhythmic precision. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee, the aroma finally cutting through the sterile, perfumed air of the house. I found some eggs, bacon, and flour hidden in the back of the pantry, and I started cooking. By 8 a.m., the smell of real butter, frying bacon, and fresh biscuits filled the house. I heard footsteps. Dustin entered the kitchen first, followed closely by Brenda. Dustin's face was pale, dark circles under his eyes. He favored his right arm, holding it stiffly against his side. Brenda looked exhausted, her makeup not yet applied, revealing the deep lines of age and stress she tried so hard to hide. They stopped in the doorway, staring at me as I casually flipped bacon in an expensive copper skillet. "Good morning," I said cheerfully, not looking away from the stove. "Breakfast is almost ready. I suggest you sit down." They exchanged a look of bewildered terror. They didn't know how to handle me. If I had been screaming, if I had been throwing things, they could have categorized me as crazy and called the police. But this calm domestic takeover was deeply unsettling. It was psychological warfare, and they were completely unarmed. They sat down at the large mahogany dining table, moving slowly, like bomb squad technicians afraid to trigger an explosion. I served them. I placed plates of perfectly cooked food in front of them, poured their coffee, and then sat down at the head of the table, Dustin's usual seat. "Eat," I commanded gently. They picked up their forks. "Now," I said, stirring my coffee, the clinking of my spoon echoing in the cavernous room, "let's discuss the new rules of this household." Dustin stared at his plate. Brenda gripped her coffee mug with white knuckles. "Rule number 1, I stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Leia's environment will be peaceful. There will be no raised voices, no slamming doors, and no intoxication of any kind in her presence. If I smell alcohol on your breath, Dustin, you will not sleep in this house." Dustin opened his mouth to protest, his pride flaring up, but his eyes met mine. He remembered the blinding pain from the night before. He closed his mouth and swallowed hard. "Rule number 2, I continued. Clara is staying at the hospital until she is fully recovered. You will not visit her. You will not call her. You will not contact her in any way. I will handle her care." "She is my wife," Dustin muttered, though the fight was completely gone from his voice. "She is my patient now," I corrected him coldly. "And you are the pathogen." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of my presence crush the air out of the room. I looked around the pristine, expensive kitchen, at the marble and the stainless steel, and then I looked at the 2 terrified people sitting across from me. They had built a fortress of wealth and status to hide their rotting, abusive core. They thought their money and their gated community made them untouchable. They thought they had broken my daughter. They were about to learn that you can never, ever underestimate a mother who has nothing left to lose and absolutely no fear of the dark. The war hadn't started with the physical fight last night. That was just the opening shot. The real war was going to be fought in the shadows of this house, and I was going to tear their pristine, fake world apart, piece by meticulously clean piece. For 3 days, the house operated under a suffocating, brittle truce. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a cardiac arrest. I did not yell. I did not threaten them again. I simply occupied their space with an absolute, immovable certainty. I woke up at dawn, cooked meals they were too terrified to refuse, and kept the house in a state of clinical perfection. Brenda tried to keep up appearances. She spent hours in her master bathroom, applying layers of expensive foundation to hide the exhaustion hollowing out her face. She would dress in her designer tennis outfits and leave for the country club, desperate to escape the suffocating reality of her own home. But I saw the slight tremor in her hands when she poured her morning espresso. I saw the way her eyes darted to the floor, actively avoiding my gaze. Dustin was worse. The pain in his arm had subsided into a deep, agonizing ache, a constant physical reminder of his profound humiliation. He stopped going to his consulting office. He drank in the dark, hiding in his study, the heavy mahogany door locked from the inside. He thought the heavy door protected him from me. He didn't realize it just made his prison smaller. My focus entirely was on Leia. We spent the afternoons in the sunroom. We didn't talk about her father. We didn't talk about the hospital. I taught her how to play gin rummy. I showed her how to braid thread into bracelets. For the first time in what must have been years, the chronic high-alert tension in her small shoulders began to soften. She was a child who had learned to survive by being invisible. I was teaching her how to take up space again. But beneath the domestic quiet, my mind was working with the relentless precision of a triage unit. Why hadn't Clara left? That was the question that kept me awake at night, staring at the sterile ceiling of the guest room. Clara was intelligent. She was strong. Yes, the cycle of abuse is a powerful, blinding vortex, but Clara had a fierce, protective instinct for Leia. She had my blood in her veins. A woman like Clara doesn't just endure a shattered orbital bone out of mere submission. She stays because she is trapped. And in a world built on the facade of wealth, the strongest traps are made of paper. On the fourth day, Brenda left for a charity luncheon at 11. Dustin had dragged himself out of the house an hour earlier, mumbling something about a meeting with his broker. The house was empty. It was time to operate. I walked down the hall to Dustin's study. The door was locked. A standard, heavy-duty brass deadbolt. In the ER, when a psychiatric patient locks themselves in a bathroom with a razor, you don't wait for the janitor to find the master key. You learn how to manipulate the environment. I went to the kitchen, retrieved a thin, flexible silicone spatula and a sturdy metal skewer. It took me less than 40 seconds to slide the silicone along the doorstop, manipulate the latch, and force the deadbolt back with a heavy click. I stepped inside. The room smelled of stale bourbon, fear, and expensive leather. The desk was a chaotic mess of unopened envelopes, final notices, and half-empty glasses. It was the desk of a man who was drowning and trying to hide the rising water. I sat in his heavy leather chair and began to search. I bypassed the obvious drawers. People with things to hide never put them in the top drawer. I looked for the subtle inconsistencies. I ran my hands under the lip of the heavy oak desk. My fingers brushed against a strip of industrial Velcro. I pulled it down. A small, flat steel lockbox fell into my lap. It was a biometric lock, requiring a thumbprint. A minor obstacle. Dustin was a sloppy man who drank too much. I looked closely at the black scanner pad. In the dim light of the study, I could see the oily, distinct smudge of a thumbprint pressed perfectly against the glass sensor. He had used it recently, his fingers greasy with sweat and alcohol. I took a piece of clear Scotch tape from the desk, pressed it firmly over the oily smudge, and lifted it. I placed the tape over my own thumb and pressed it to the scanner. The lockbox beeped, a tiny green light flashing, and the lid popped open. Inside were 3 thick manila envelopes. I opened the first one. Bank statements. Not the glossy, fabricated ones Dustin probably left on the kitchen counter, but the real ones. The Rakes Family Trust. The accounts were empty, not just low, decimated, overdrawn by tens of thousands of dollars. I opened the second envelope, my heart turning into a cold, heavy stone. It was a file on Leia, specifically her college fund, set up by my late husband before he passed. It had been nearly $100,000, meant to secure her future. The statements showed a series of massive withdrawals over the past 3 years. The final balance, dated 2 months ago, was $14.32. Dustin had drained a 10-year-old's future to pay for his tailored suits and country club dues. My hands began to shake, not with age, but with a fury so profound it felt like a physical sickness. But it was the third envelope that finally revealed the true depth of the rot. They were mortgage documents. Dustin and Brenda didn't own this pristine, sprawling colonial house. The bank owned it, and they were severely underwater. But the name on the second and third high-interest predatory loans wasn't Dustin's. It was Clara's. I stared at the signatures at the bottom of the contracts. Clara Rakes. It was a good forgery, but I was her mother. I knew the loop of her C, the slight slant of her A. Dustin had forged her signature to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars against the house. The trap suddenly became terrifyingly clear. If Clara went to the police, if she filed for divorce, Dustin's financial crimes would be exposed, yes. But in the immediate fallout, Clara would be held liable for the debt. She would be ruined. Her credit destroyed, her home foreclosed, drowning in a sea of fraudulent debt while fighting a brutal custody battle against a man with a ruthlessly expensive lawyer paid for by stolen money. They hadn't just broken her bones. They had engineered a financial hostage situation. They held her completely captive, ensuring her silence through the sheer terror of total destitution. I carefully placed the documents back into the lockbox. I sealed it, wiped the scanner clean, and reattached it under the desk. I sat in the silence of the study for a long time. The anger receded, replaced by a crystalline absolute clarity. Justice through the legal system would take years. It would drag Clara through the mud. It would traumatize Laya. The courts might eventually untangle the fraud, but in the meantime, Dustin and Brenda would use every dirty trick to drag my daughter down with them. No, the legal system was designed for civilized people. Dustin and Brenda were predators wearing designer clothes. And when dealing with predators, you do not hire a lawyer. You build a cage. The escalation happened that evening. I was in the kitchen, washing a coffee cup, when I heard the garage door rumble open. Dustin and Brenda entered together. They didn't come into the kitchen. They stopped in the mudroom, their voices hushed, urgent, and laced with panic. I stood perfectly still, letting the water run to mask the sound of my breathing, and listened. "He's ready," Dustin was saying, his voice a frantic whisper. "Doc Evans said he can have the paperwork signed by midnight. Section 12, involuntary psychiatric hold, severe dementia, aggressive paranoia. It covers everything." "Are you sure his guys are discreet?" Brenda asked, her voice trembling. "If the neighbors see—" "They use an unmarked van," Dustin snapped. "2 heavy-duty orderlies. They'll come to the back door. They'll sedate her, strap her to a gurney, and take her to the private facility in Oak Brook. Once she's in the psych ward, pumped full of Haldol, nobody is going to believe a word she says about us, Clara, or the money. She'll just be a crazy old woman." "And Clara?" "Clara won't do a damn thing," Dustin sneered. "Not when I remind her about the second mortgage. She'll fall right back into line once the old witch is gone." I turned off the faucet. The sound of the running water died away, leaving only the cold, metallic drip of the sink. They were going to commit me. They had found a corrupt doctor willing to sign a fake psychiatric hold, and they were sending muscle to drag me out of the house in the middle of the night. It was a desperate, incredibly dangerous move. It was exactly the mistake I needed them to make. I checked the wall clock. 8 p.m. If they were waiting for the cover of darkness, I had maybe 3 hours. I walked upstairs, my posture relaxed, my face a mask of pleasant oblivion. I passed them in the hallway. Dustin flinched slightly. Brenda forced a tight, sickeningly sweet smile. "Going to bed early, Rosy?" Brenda asked. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "The arthritis is acting up. I think I'll sleep heavily tonight." "Good," Dustin muttered, looking away. "Rest up." I went to Leia's room. She was reading a book under her blankets with a flashlight. I sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hair. "Leia, baby," I whispered. "Grandma is going to play a game tonight. A very quiet game, but I need you to promise me something. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not leave this room. Do not open the door. Can you promise me that?" She looked at me, her big eyes reflecting the beam of the flashlight. She sensed the gravity in my voice. She nodded slowly. "I promise, Grandma." I kissed her forehead, walked out, and locked her door from the outside using the master key I had liberated from Dustin's desk. She was safe. Now I had to prepare the operating room. In emergency medicine, the environment dictates the outcome. You control the lighting, you control the access, you control the tools. I moved silently through the house, gathering my supplies. From the laundry room, a large bottle of industrial-strength liquid fabric softener. From the kitchen, a spray bottle of ammonia-based heavy-duty oven cleaner, and a jar of pure, concentrated capsaicin extract, ghost pepper powder, Dustin used for his chili. In my room, I mixed the oven cleaner with the capsaicin powder. The resulting liquid was a viscous, dark orange sludge. It wasn't lethal, but aerosolized into the eyes and respiratory tract. It would cause immediate, blinding pain, violently restricting the airways. A homemade, highly concentrated pepper spray, far more potent than anything the police carried. At 11:30 p.m., the house was completely dark. Dustin and Brenda were hiding in the master suite upstairs, waiting for the dirty work to be done. I went down to the basement. The basement was massive, unfinished concrete, smelling of damp earth. At the bottom of the wooden stairs was a heavy, solid-core steel fire door. I took the bottle of liquid fabric softener and poured it generously over the top 4 wooden steps, letting the thick, slick blue liquid coat the wood. In the dark, it would be invisible. Under a rubber-soled shoe, it would act like black ice. I moved to the electrical panel. I found the main breaker switch. At 11:50 p.m., I heard the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel of the back alley. A vehicle idling. The soft, heavy thud of van doors closing. Footsteps approaching the back patio door. They were here. I gripped the main breaker switch. I took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the layout of the house, calculating the distance, the angles, the timing. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness become my ally. I pulled the heavy switch down. Clack! The entire house plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The faint hum of the refrigerator died. The glow of the digital clocks vanished. I stood in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs, the steel door propped open, the modified spray bottle heavy in my right hand. I heard the sound of a key sliding into the back patio door. Dustin had left it unlocked for them, or given them a key. The door creaked open. "Lights are out," a deep, gruff voice whispered. "Don't matter, we got flashlights. Dustin said she's in the guest room at the end of the hall. Let's just dart her, bag her, and get paid." A second voice. Professional thugs. Two beams of harsh LED light sliced through the darkness of the kitchen above. I could hear their heavy boots on the hardwood floor. "Hey," the first voice said. "Basement door is open. Check it. Make sure she ain't hiding down there. Dustin said she's crazy." The beam of light swept toward the top of the basement stairs. I flattened myself against the cold concrete wall at the bottom, entirely consumed by the shadows. Heavy, aggressive footsteps approached the top of the wooden stairs. "Come out, Grandma," the thug called out, his voice mocking. "Time for your medicine." He took the first step down. His heavy boot hit the thick layer of fabric softener. Physics is a beautiful, unforgiving science. When a 200-pound man loses friction on a downward slope, gravity takes over instantly. He didn't even have time to scream. Both of his feet shot out from under him. He went airborne, his flashlight flying from his hand, the beam spinning wildly across the ceiling. He hit the edge of the wooden stairs with his lower back, a sickening crack echoing in the dark, and tumbled violently down the remaining steps, crashing in a heap of groans and shattered breath onto the concrete floor at my feet. "Mick!" the second man yelled from the top of the stairs, panic spiking in his voice. He rushed forward, pointing his flashlight down into the dark. The beam caught my face. I didn't flinch. I raised my arm, aiming the nozzle of the spray bottle directly into the beam of light, and pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The chemical capsaicin cloud hit him square in the face as he leaned over the stairwell. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. He dropped the flashlight as both hands flew to his face. He let out a blood-curdling shriek of pure agony, a sound of raw, unadulterated suffering. The ammonia blinded him, while the ghost pepper extract set his mucous membranes on fire. He stumbled blindly backward, clutching his throat, gagging and retching as his airways violently constricted. The first man, Mick, was trying to push himself up off the concrete floor, groaning, his spine likely fractured. In the pitch black, guided only by the scattered rolling beams of the dropped flashlights, I stepped forward. I didn't feel a shred of pity. These men were here to inject me with sedatives and steal my life away for a paycheck. They were monsters, and they had walked into the wrong house. I brought my heavy orthopedic shoe down hard on the side of Mick's knee joint. The joint popped, and he collapsed back to the floor with a strangled cry, completely immobilized. I stepped over him, walked out of the basement, and grabbed the heavy steel fire door. "Tell whoever hired you," I said into the dark, my voice echoing off the concrete walls, cold and unyielding, "that the doctor is out." I slammed the heavy steel door shut, engaging the exterior deadbolt, locking the 2 men in the pitch-black, soundproof concrete tomb of the basement. The muffled sounds of screaming and coughing were instantly cut off. Absolute silence returned to the house. I stood in the dark kitchen. My heart rate was barely elevated. I wiped a stray drop of the chemical spray from the nozzle and set the bottle on the granite counter. Upstairs, a door opened. "Mick?" Dustin's voice called down, trembling, stripped of all its arrogant bravado. "Is it done?" I walked slowly to the bottom of the grand staircase. I didn't turn on the lights. I looked up into the darkness, knowing he was standing at the top, peering over the railing, waiting for his mercenaries to bring him my sedated body. "Dustin?" I called up, my voice calm, melodic, and echoing through the massive empty foyer. I heard a sharp intake of breath. He froze. "Dustin, dear," I continued, resting my hand on the polished mahogany banister. "Your friends seem to have had an accident in the basement. They are going to be down there for quite a while." Silence. Thick, terrified silence from the second floor. "I know about the mortgages, Dustin," I said, letting the words float up into the dark like a death sentence. "I know about the forged signatures. I know about Laya's empty college fund. I know everything." A muffled sob. Brenda. She was standing behind him. "You thought you were dealing with an old woman you could throw away," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet house. "You are not. You are dealing with a mother who is going to tear your life down to the studs. Go back to sleep, Dustin. Tomorrow is going to be a very busy day." I turned my back on the stairs and walked toward the living room. I sat down in Brenda's velvet chair in the pitch black, resting my hands in my lap. I didn't need to lock my door tonight. They wouldn't dare come downstairs. They were trapped in their own home, surrounded by the wreckage of their failed plot, with a monster of their own making waiting for them in the dark. The siege of the house was over. The destruction of their empire had officially begun. Dawn broke over the suburbs, not with warmth, but with a cold, gray indifference. At 5 a.m., I walked to the basement door. I hadn't slept. I didn't need to. I unlocked the heavy steel deadbolt and pulled the door open. The smell of ammonia, ghost pepper, and sweat wafted up from the darkness. I flipped on the stairwell light. The two mercenaries were huddled on the concrete floor, a pathetic, broken heap of bruised egos and battered limbs. The one named Mick was clutching his swollen knee, his face pale. The other man was still rubbing his violently bloodshot eyes, his breathing ragged. "The sun is up," I said, my voice echoing down the stairwell, flat and devoid of any emotion. "You have exactly 60 seconds to walk out the back door, get in your van, and drive away. If you are still on this property when the clock strikes 5:02, I will call the police, and I will show them the heavy-duty zip ties and syringes I found in your pockets. Understand?" They didn't speak. They just scrambled. Mick leaned heavily on his partner, and together they hobbled up the stairs, avoiding my eyes, terrified of the 65-year-old woman standing in a cardigan at the top of the landing. The back door clicked shut behind them. I heard the van's engine start and tires peel out down the alley. I walked to the electrical panel and flipped the main breaker. The house hummed back to life. The digital oven clock flashed 5:05 a.m. I made a pot of tea. The war was entering its final phase. I heard the soft padding of bare feet on the hardwood. I turned to see Leia standing in the kitchen entrance, clutching her ragged, headless cloth doll against her chest. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Grandma?" she whispered. "Did the bad men go away?" "Yes, baby girl," I said, kneeling down to her eye level. "They went far away. They won't ever come back." She nodded slowly. She walked toward me and held out the old, battered doll. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive toys in her room. "Mommy said to keep Mr. Button safe," Leia said, her voice barely a whisper. "She said if she ever went to sleep for a long time, I had to give him to you. Only you." A cold prickle of electricity ran down the back of my neck. If she ever went to sleep for a long time, it was Clara's code for being hospitalized. Or worse. I took the doll. It felt slightly heavier than a cloth doll should. I ran my fingers along the stitched back. Beneath the cheap cotton stuffing, nestled deep in the center of the doll, I felt a hard rectangular lump. "Thank you, Leia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "You did a very brave job keeping him safe. Go wash your face, sweetheart. I'll make pancakes." As soon as she went upstairs, I took a paring knife from the block. With surgical precision, I slit the seam of the doll's back. It was a silver USB thumb drive. I immediately went to Dustin's study, plugged the drive into his laptop, and bypassed his password screen using the master administrative reboot I'd learned from a hospital IT tech years ago. The drive opened. My breath caught in my throat. Clara hadn't just been surviving. She had been operating. The drive contained gigabytes of meticulously organized data. There were PDFs of the forged loan documents, alongside high-resolution scans of Clara's actual signature for comparison. There were audio recordings taken from her phone, capturing Dustin's drunken, terrifying rages, explicitly admitting to draining Leia's college fund and threatening to kill Clara if she exposed him. And then there was the video folder. Clara had hidden a micro camera in the living room bookshelf. I clicked on a file dated 3 weeks ago. The video showed Brenda and Dustin sitting on the velvet sofa. "The bank is calling again, Dustin," Brenda's voice hissed on the recording. "If Clara finds out about the second mortgage—" "She won't," Dustin interrupted, pouring a drink. "And if she starts asking questions, I'll just remind her what happens when she talks back. She's weak, Ma. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her." Tears blurred my vision, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming pride. My daughter was not a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a soldier trapped behind enemy lines, gathering the intelligence needed to call in an airstrike. She had endured the physical blows to protect the digital evidence that would secure her total freedom. I pulled the USB drive out. It was an airtight prosecutorial masterpiece. I could take it to the police right now. They would arrest Dustin. But as I looked around the opulent, sickeningly perfect study, I realized that a quiet arrest wasn't enough. The legal system is sterile. It happens behind closed doors. For people like Dustin and Brenda, who worshipped status and public perception above all else, a quiet courtroom was a mercy. They had hidden their rot behind a facade of suburban perfection. The only true justice was to burn that facade to the ground in broad daylight. I looked at the calendar on Dustin's desk. Today's date was circled in thick red marker: Spring Charity Gala, hosted by Brenda Rakes. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. By noon, the caterers had arrived. The backyard was transformed into a sickeningly elegant display of wealth. Champagne fountains, silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, and a massive LED screen set up by the patio, intended to show a slideshow of the underprivileged children Brenda's charity ostensibly supported. Brenda and Dustin had emerged from their room around 10 a.m. They looked like walking corpses. Dustin's right arm was in a sling. He had clearly self-diagnosed the sprain I gave him. Brenda's eyes were bloodshot behind her heavy designer sunglasses. They saw me sitting in the kitchen, calmly drinking tea. They didn't say a word. They were operating under a massive delusion. They believed that because I hadn't called the police yet, I was either bluffing or negotiating. They thought if they could just get through this gala, if they could just maintain their public mask, they could somehow fix the mess behind the scenes. "The guests will be arriving at 1, Brenda said tightly, staring at the floor. "I would appreciate it if you stayed in your room." "I wouldn't dream of ruining your party, Brenda," I replied smoothly. I didn't stay in my room. At 12:30 p.m., I walked out the front door and down the street to the massive stone house on the corner. Martha Higgins was the president of the Homeowners Association. She was a formidable, sharp-eyed woman with old money and a deep, abiding hatred for new money trash, like Brenda Rakes. Over the past few days, I had noticed Martha walking her poodle past the house, lingering, her eyes narrowing at the subtle signs of tension. I rang her doorbell. When she answered, I didn't waste time. "Martha," I said, "my name is Rosy. I'm Clara's mother." Martha looked me up and down, her sharp eyes registering my calm demeanor. "I know who you are. I also know Clara didn't fall down any stairs. What do you want?" "I want to borrow the master tablet for the neighborhood's audiovisual equipment," I said. Brenda had rented the HOA's high-end projector and surround sound system for her party. Martha controlled the network. Martha raised an eyebrow. "And why would I give that to you?" I handed her the USB drive. "Plug this into your computer. Open the folder labeled Financials. Tell me if you want Brenda Rakes hosting charity events in your neighborhood after you read it." Martha stepped back, gesturing me inside. 10 minutes later, she walked back into the foyer. Her face was flushed with indignation. "They're bankrupt," Martha whispered, disgusted. "They are actively defrauding the bank and stealing from a child. And today," I said gently, "Brenda is going to ask all your wealthy friends to write checks to a charity she controls. I think your friends deserve to know who they are giving their money to. Don't you?" Martha Higgins smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. She reached into the console table and handed me an iPad. "The network password is saved," Martha said. "The projector and the garden speakers are fully synced. Do what you have to do, Rosy. I'll make sure the police are on standby at the front gate." By 2 p.m., the garden was packed. The elite of the Chicago suburbs were dressed in pastel linens and silk sundresses, sipping mimosas and laughing. Dustin was mingling, sweating profusely through his expensive linen suit, his fake smile plastered on his face as he talked to his boss, the senior partner of his consulting firm. Brenda tapped a silver spoon against her crystal glass. The gentle chiming silenced the crowd. She stood on the patio steps, the picture of aristocratic grace. "Thank you all for coming," Brenda projected, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Today is about giving back. It's about family. As many of you know, my dear daughter-in-law, Clara, was recently hospitalized after a tragic accident at home. But even in our dark times, we must remember those less fortunate." I stood in the shadows of the sunroom, looking through the glass doors. I held the iPad in my hands. I had already uploaded Clara's files to the cloud server linked to the tablet. I waited for Brenda to reach the emotional peak of her lie. "And so I ask you to open your hearts and your checkbooks as we begin our presentation," Brenda concluded, gesturing elegantly to the massive LED screen behind her. She clicked her remote. Instead of a picture of smiling orphans, the massive screen flickered black, then illuminated with a stark, high-resolution PDF of a foreclosure notice. The bold red letters default spanned 10 feet across the screen. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Brenda frowned, clicking her remote frantically. "A minor technical glitch, excuse me." I pressed the play audio button on the iPad. The heavy, high-fidelity surround sound speakers hidden throughout the garden crackled to life. It wasn't music. It was Dustin's voice, recorded just weeks prior, echoing at a deafening volume across the manicured lawns. "I don't give a damn what the bank says." Dustin's recorded voice roared over the speakers, slurred and violently aggressive. "You sign the second mortgage, Clara, or I swear to God I will break your other arm. You are nothing. You own nothing." The champagne glasses stopped clinking. The silence in the garden became absolute, suffocating, broken only by the horrific audio playing from the speakers. Brenda went sheet white. She dropped the microphone. It hit the stone patio with a screeching thud of feedback. On the massive screen, the image shifted. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, Clara's real signature. On the right, the forged signature on a $300,000 loan document. Beneath it, a bank statement showing Leia's college fund drained to $14. Dustin's boss, standing near the front, lowered his drink, his face twisting in absolute disgust. People began backing away from Dustin as if he were carrying a plague. Dustin spun around wildly, his eyes darting across the crowd, until his gaze locked onto the glass doors of the sunroom. He saw me standing in the shadows, the iPad illuminating my face. The mask completely slipped. The suburban gentleman vanished, leaving only the violent, cornered animal. "You bitch!" Dustin screamed, a raw, guttural roar. He shoved past a wealthy dowager, knocking her into a table of hors d'oeuvres, and charged toward the sunroom. I didn't move. I didn't lock the door. I just watched him run. He didn't make it to the patio. Suddenly, the side gate burst open. 5 uniformed police officers, led by a stern-faced sergeant, flooded into the backyard. Martha Higgins had timed her call perfectly. "Dustin Rakes!" the sergeant bellowed, drawing his taser. "Get on the ground, now!" Dustin froze, trapped between me and the police. He looked at the officers, then at the crowd of his peers, his boss, his country club friends, his neighbors, all watching him with open abhorrence. He saw the screens broadcasting his financial ruin. He heard his own abusive voice still echoing faintly from the speakers. He fell to his knees on the perfectly manicured grass, his hands shaking, his chest heaving. The police slammed him onto his stomach, cuffing his hands roughly behind his back. I stepped out of the sunroom and walked slowly to the edge of the patio. Brenda was leaning heavily against a stone pillar, gasping for air. Her carefully constructed universe had just been atomized in front of her eyes. She wasn't having a heart attack. She was experiencing total, irreversible social annihilation. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, pleading silently for a mercy she did not deserve. I looked down at her, my face a mask of stone. "You missed a spot on the carpet, Brenda," I whispered. I turned my back on her and walked through the crowd. The wealthy guests parted for me like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with shock and a strange, silent reverence. I walked out the front door, down the driveway, and didn't look back as the sirens began to wail in the distance. 4 months later, the legal fallout was swift and merciless, aided by the sheer volume of immaculate evidence Clara had compiled and I had delivered. Dustin took a plea deal for felony fraud, forgery, and aggravated assault to avoid a lengthy trial. He was serving 7 to 10 years in a state penitentiary. Brenda, completely bankrupt and utterly ostracized by her social circle, was forced to move into a low-income subsidized apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The bank foreclosed on the colonial house, wiping away the dark memories built within its walls. With the help of a phenomenal lawyer, paid for by a sudden anonymous donation from the neighborhood HOA, courtesy of Martha Higgins, Clara's name was entirely cleared of the fraudulent debt. She was granted sole custody of Leia. We didn't go back to the suburbs. We moved into a beautiful, sun-drenched penthouse apartment in the city, overlooking Lake Michigan. It wasn't massive, but it was safe. It was warm. It was ours. I stood on the balcony, leaning against the railing, feeling the cool breeze coming off the lake. The arthritis in my hands still ached in the mornings, but the chronic heavy weight on my chest was gone. Behind me, inside the apartment, I could hear the sounds of life. Music was playing softly from a speaker. Leia was laughing, a real uninhibited belly laugh, as Clara chased her around the kitchen island with a dollop of pancake batter on her nose. Clara walked out onto the balcony, wrapping a warm blanket around my shoulders. The bruises on her face had long since faded, but the change in her was deeper than skin. The hunted, terrified look in her eyes was gone. She stood tall. She was a survivor who had reclaimed her own narrative. "Coffee, Mom?" she asked, handing me a steaming mug. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, taking a sip. She leaned her head on my shoulder, looking out at the endless expanse of the blue water. "I still can't believe it's over," she whispered. "I thought we would be trapped forever." "A cage is only as strong as your belief in it," I replied softly, putting my arm around her. People often confuse justice with vengeance. They think justice is about anger, about striking back in a blind rage. But 30 years in an emergency room taught me the truth. Vengeance is messy. It bleeds, it infects, it destroys the person wielding it as much as the target. True justice is clinical. It is a surgical procedure. It is the cold, calculated removal of a tumor so that the rest of the body can survive and heal. I didn't destroy Dustin and Brenda out of hatred. I dismantled them because they were a disease that was killing my family. I am Rosy. I am a mother, a grandmother, and a nurse. I have spent my life pulling people back from the brink of death. But the most important life I ever saved was the one standing right next to me, watching the sun rise over a brand new world. And if you are listening to this, if you are sitting in the dark, feeling trapped by someone who tells you that you are nothing, remember the white carpet. Remember that the grandest fortresses are often built on paper. Gather your evidence, bide your time, and never ever forget the power of a woman who has finally decided she has had enough.